or good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A history of the Irish pharmaceutical industry. If I was asked to sum up this talk in 2 minutes, I would mention Glaxo. Now, Glaxo, of course, an English company at the time, had a long established presence in Ireland, but in the 1950s, its products were hit with new tariffs and increasing tariffs. And in response, they built a plant on Grand Canal Street in Dublin, more or less beside the old Sir Patrick Dunn's Hospital, and on the way out to the Aviva Stadium, or Lansdowne Road, as they would have called it. When the plant was opened, the then managing director, Mr. McHugh, proclaimed, "We are now essentially an Irish company. Our staff is entirely of Irish nationals. Full use is made of local materials and services. We are now manufacturing or processing some 200 products." And their Irishness formed the key for a lot of their advertising. And when he said that his staff were all Irish nationals, he was talking about a total of 37 people in the manufacturing side. But a huge range of products, none for export. Nothing there was for export. They were all purely for the Irish market. Now, fast forward 60 years, the plant is gone, replaced by an office block, which in turn has been replaced by a more modern office block currently occupied by Google. Glaxo is now part of the multinational GSK or GlaxoSmithKline, but they still have a manufacturing presence in Ireland. And it's in Dungarvan. And there it is. And that complex manufactures one product, but it does so for the world. It manufactures paracetamol or Panadol. Last year, they made in excess of 7 billion dosages. It employs 725 people directly, another couple of hundred indirectly, and exports to more than 75 different countries around the world. And that, in a way, is a microcosm of the story of Irish pharmaceutical manufacturing. How we went from small, inefficient plants supplying the Irish market only to supplying the world with these huge plants scattered around the country. Now, pharmaceutical manufacturing in Ireland did not actually begin with Glaxo. And it's worthwhile taking a quick look at the evolution of pharmaceutical manufacturing. And when I was doing the research, I found this part incredibly fascinating, but equally incredibly frustrating. Fascinating because of the descriptions of many of the medicines that they had. In a 10th century manuscript describes one medicine. It says it's for swelling of the head, of wounds from iron, of burning from fire, of the bite of the hound. It prevented the lassitude of old age, cures the decline and rupture of blood vessels, etc., etc., etc. But the frustrating thing is it gives no detail whatsoever of the manufacture. Wouldn't you love to be able to manufacture a medicine like that and market it accordingly? But no description of the manufacturer. Now, medicine in Ireland developed, and it was primarily rested on medical families within the great lordships, the O'Neills, etc. But it was comparable in a sense to what was going on across Europe. And a Dutch writer in the late 16th century described Gaelic medicine, how it came with families, which the knowledge was handed down by means of a book with the remedies attached, which remedies were vernacular, the production of their own country. And it actually said, for this reason, the Irish are better managed in sickness than the Italians, who have a physician in every village. The first indication we get of how medicines were made at the period comes from Robert Boyle, who did more than invent Boyle's law for the benefit of junior certificate students. This one in particular really appealed to me. Take earthworms, wash them well in white wine to cleanse them, but so that they may not die in the wine. Then upon hollow tiles or between them, dry the worms with moderate heat, and no further than they may be conveniently reduced to powder. To 1 ounce of which add a pretty number of grains of ambergris, both to perfume the powder, whose scent of itself is rank, and to make the medicine more efficacious. The dose is from 1 dram to 1.5 drams. So he's given the ingredients, he's giving the manufacturing method, and by the way, ambergris was found in the bowels of whales, and also the dosage. Now, he was particularly fond of ground earthworms because for piles, he recommended that they be mixed with goose grease and then applied. So we're beginning to get, but that level of medicine, if you like, the traditional, was disappearing. What was coming in was the European form, which had come via England, where the manufacture of medicines was the prerogative of apothecaries. Now, the first apothecary to arrive in Ireland did so in 1171, along with Henry II. When Henry went back to England, the apothecary stayed in Dublin, and 3 years later, he applied to the king for a grant on the grounds, and I quote, that the barbarous Irish will not buy my excellent medicines, unquote. The king did not give him any money. So apothecaries tended to be associated with the places conquered by the Normans. But with the expansion of the conquest of Ireland, by the 17th century, we apparently had a lot of apothecaries, particularly in Dublin. And one person wrote to the King of England saying, there are more persons in Dublin at the present day practicing the art of medicine than any other art. And it goes on. Here, not only cursed mountebanks, ignorant barbers, and shameless quack compounders, but also persons of every other craft whatsoever, loose women, and those dregs of humanity who are either tired of their proper art or craft, or inflamed with an unbridled passion for making money. Needless to say, that does not describe current apothecaries or pharmacists. But it was not until the end of the 18th century that you began to get control, education, and regulation of the apothecaries. And throughout the 19th century, now the detail of that ad is not important, but it does mention a compounding department separate from the retail to prevent interruption, etc., and to staffed by qualified, licensed apothecaries. So we have, if you like, the apothecary model, but unlike other countries in Europe, you take, for example, Beecham in the UK, went from a single apothecary shop to a very large enterprise by licensing other pharmacies to make the products that they were making, to sell the products they were making. So they were moving into the manufacture and supply totally. An awful lot, most of the great names in pharmaceutical industry, whether it was Beecham's as it was at the time, Wellcome, Allen and Hambury in the UK, Merck, Schering-Plough in Germany, Eli Lilly, Pfizer, etc., in the US, all began as small apothecaries who decided to focus on the manufacturing and then send their products to other pharmacies for retail. That did not happen in Ireland for two reasons: the small size of the home market, and equally, British manufacturing pharmacists saw Ireland as part of their market, and the Irish pharmacists were being supplied by English manufacturing pharmacies. The First World War changed an awful lot of things, particularly in the pharmaceutical industry, particularly in the UK and US manufacturing industry. Germany dominated the world supply of pharmaceuticals because of their excellent chemical industry. 1914, supply of medicines out of Germany stopped because of the war, and the British government in particular put a huge investment into developing their own manufacturing capabilities, giving grants to the Beechams, etc., to expand. The only impact in Ireland was the gathering of sphagnum moss, which was used as an antiseptic dressing. And there were a couple of thousand people involved in gathering the moss, grading the moss, putting it with bandages and sending it off to the Western Front. But when the war ended, that closed immediately. Independence made no difference whatsoever. We continued to be primarily an agricultural country supplying the UK market. And in return, we bought in manufactured goods, including most of the pharmaceuticals. A number of the Irish pharmacies, such as Hayes, Cunningham and Roberts, continued small-scale manufacturing, but was very small. The introduction of tariffs in the 1930s facilitated some companies in setting up in Ireland to manufacture pharmaceuticals. Aspro Nicholas built this factory in Inchicore. It won an architectural award, but it was manufacturing purely for the Irish market and contributed nothing to exports. John Lemass set up what was called the Committee on Industrial Organisation in 1962. It examined Irish manufacturing, Irish employment, sector by sector. On the report on the manufacture of drugs, medicines and disinfectants, they found 18 firms solely employed doing that. 23 others did partly manufacture in pharmaceuticals. Most did so under license from foreign firms. Total employment was 803, and there were complaints about the shortage of qualified chemists. Total output was £1.3 million. Exports, 300,000, but in comparison, we imported some 3 million. It was secondary manufacturing only. The equipment was old, inefficient, underutilized, undercapitalized. It was estimated that all of the firms had extensive spare capacity, even when working on only one shift, and that some of them had up to 80% spare capacity. Lacking investment, you would have said, come free trade, that sector is finished. But there was some hope. There was an alternative. There were 3 companies operating at the time in Ireland: Antigen in Roscrea, Leo Laboratories in Dublin, and Roa. What did they have in common? They were foreign owned and they were export orientated. Now let's look at those for a moment. Antigen was founded by George Faisenfeld. He had come in the 1930s from Germany and he set up a meat factory in Roscrea. Post-war, he was looking for something to use some of the waste products from his meat manufacturing. And he developed what he called Megalon oral blood tonic, combining liver extract. The liver extract obviously coming from the cattle that were being processed in the factory. He also focused very much on supplying the new National Health Service in the UK, which is all done by contract. And he prided himself and he prided the company that they could develop that based on a request for a contract, for a tender. They could develop a formulation in the morning, test it in the afternoon, manufacture it the next day, and have it ready for shipment 2 days later. That's of their factory. And here's an interesting one. The Nina Guardian, February the 9th, 1963. And it says, last week, a party of from Saigon, South Vietnam, visited the Antigen plant at Ross Cray, where they toured the firm's production and control facilities. 6 months later, the Irish Times has this photograph. Some of the Antigen products on the last lap of their journey in South Vietnam being distributed in the Mekong Delta in South Vietnam. And you can see the A for Antigen. Export to the ends of the earth or die. Leo Laboratories was set up in a disused cigarette factory in Crumlin in 1958, and it too focused on exports. And I think Michael O'Leary would love this, how to handle things. The company van drives onto the tarmac and the material is loaded straight onto the plane. No need for check-ins or anything else like that. ROA in Bantry, established by Roland Wagner in 1960, similarly had a focus on exports. And also the other thing coming into play was tax relief. Brought in 1956 against sustained opposition from the Department of Finance. The Department of Finance argued very strongly against tax relief. And among the arguments that they used, and one I've never understood, is that it would delay the time when they could tax profits on farm exports. I don't see any connection, but they obviously did. So it started at 0% tax on 50% of the profits for 5 years. And you can see how it evolved. By 1960, 100% of profits for 15 years. Under pressure from our EU partners, it became 10% tax on profits earned from manufacturing, all manufacturing, not just exports. And then in 1989, until this year, it was 12.5% tax on all corporate profits. And as Paul White has described it, the unique and essential foundation stone of Ireland's foreign investment boom. And that's huge contribution to it like that. Now, in the drive in the 1960s, the IDA did not focus on pharmaceuticals. They focused on light engineering, such as car components, clothing, and mostly European countries. But 3 plants were established, 3 big plants were established in Ireland in the 1960s. And for each one of them, there was an element of serendipity. Wilhelm Schuler, director of research at Degussa in Germany, and also owner of a substantial chemical and pharmaceutical manufacturing company in his own right, himself and his partner Bendrickson were interested in expanding. And they first thought of looking at Portugal. When they came across in a magazine in Germany an ad by the IDA, they contacted the IDA. Dr. Schuler traveled to Dublin, met the IDA, who tried to interest him in investing in a plant in the Cork area. He went down there, was not too impressed. At the end of his visit, he decided to take a few days holidays, hired a car, drove down the East Coast, and stopped for lunch in Wicklow. After lunch, walked up to town, saw that ad in an auctioneer. 52 acres, Cop's house in a beautiful wooded valley up in Rathdrum. He bought it. The next year, in that outhouse, he made his first piece of pharmaceutical active substance in that outhouse with some equipment he had brought in and with 2 operators that he brought over from Germany. That is what it is now, after he sold it to Sharing Plough, who later sold it to Zoetis. And if I can use the cursor, Kopp's house is still there. There was another, Squibb had expressed an interest in building a plant in Swords in the 1950s. It was primarily the brainchild of a Polish exile, Konstanty Scheinert. He was very interested in getting manufacturing going, but it failed. He left the company and, his project idea failed. He left the company, but Squibb came back to it, and in the 1960s built a plant in Swords, which is still functioning there. But the third episode in the 1960s was the game changer, absolute game changer. And it's all due to that gentleman on the left with the glasses, John A. Mulcahy. Mulcahy, a native of Dungarvan, had taken the wrong side, or the losing side, during the Irish Civil War, having served with the volunteers in the War of Independence. He was interned. When he was released, could not get a job, so headed for New York, like so many other Republicans. He attended university there at nighttime, qualified as an accountant, joined a chemical company called Quigley Magnesite, rose to become president, CEO, and a major shareholder. He insisted that Quigley Magnesite build a plant in Dungarvan, in Abercorty, which lasted for 20, 30 years, producing magnesite for the lining of furnaces. In 1967, Pfizer, which in the 1960s was primarily a chemicals company rather than pharmaceuticals, bought Quigley Magnesite, and as part of the deal, John A. Mulcahy joined the main board. At his first board meeting, one of the items for discussion was a new citric acid plant. Citric acid is a huge chemical, widely used as a food additive, in soft drinks. It's also used in curing steel. It's very, very wide-ranging, and there's huge demand for it. Pfizer dominated the world market. They had 5 big plants, and they needed a 6th. And they had more or less decided to put it in Sandwich in Kent, which would make sense putting it near one of their major markets, the UK. Mulcahy interrupted the discussion and said, no, Ireland. They did not reach a decision at that meeting. At the next meeting, Mulcahy repeated that performance, interrupting, saying, sorry, no, we must at the very least consider Ireland. And in a way, almost to keep him quiet, they engaged with the IDA. And after very intense negotiations, they set up the citric acid plant. That's the site they picked. A photograph taken in 1968. 40 years later, that's the same site, but with the Pfizer plant on it, which later expanded, but we'll talk about that. Now, Pfizer coming to Ireland was operating on a different scale to anything else. The number of people employed, the size of the site, the demand for services, such as electricity, clean water, etc. The demand for engineering support, which was met at the time by a number of subsidiary companies set up by English or American consultancy firms. Critically, after they opened the citric acid plant, they decided to build an organic synthesis plant. And that, in a way, as I said, was the game changer. Where Pfizer was leading, other plants followed. And it was helped by a crucial, absolutely crucial change in the IDA's approach. The IDA reviewed their strategy in 1970. Up to that, they would have small offices, one office in the States, a couple of people there. And if they got a query they would respond by sending literature. They decided that wasn't working. So instead, they went for a proactive, strengthen the local offices, give them the task of forging a relationship with companies before they made an investment decision, before they even considered an investment decision, and target certain sectors, in particular, the pharmaceutical sector at the time. The late Sean Ward of the IADA told me that he had spent 7 years developing a relationship with Schering-Plough in Chicago before they decided to invest in Ireland. The key thing was, as soon as they considered an investment, they knew who to talk to, they knew what was on offer, and Sean was the person. Then in the 70s, then you had a tremendous expansion. Companies came, Syntex to Clarecastle, Penn to Ringaskiddy, Janssen to Little Island, Merck as Merck Sharp and Dome to Clonmel, and other companies up and down the country. It was a tremendous period of boom. But towards the end of the 70s, there was a dark cloud on the horizon. Some of the companies had got a reputation, or a bad reputation, for environmental emissions, particularly to the air. People associated the Syntex plant in Clarecastle with the smell of sulfur hanging over the village. In 1978, Schering-Plough, with their first thought of investment, announced that they were going to build a factory a couple of miles from the Merck Sharp and Dome factory near Clonmel. Some local residents objected, and they had developed a strategy, used the planning process, used the legal system to delay, and the chances are that corporate headquarters will get worried at all these delays and go somewhere else. It worked to an extent with Schering-Plough. After 2 years, they abandoned their plans to build at Clonmel. Equally, Beecham's announced a plan to build a plant at the Shannon Airport Industrial Complex. Again, the use of the planning process slowed down until Beecham, after 2.5 years, got tired of this, cancelled the proposed investment in Ireland, and went to Singapore instead. And to compound all of that, there began a saga in the 1980s of environmental issues. Sorry, I should have said that's Eli Lilly, the plant in Kinsale, which was at the end of the 1980s, and beautiful plant located in the countryside there. But in the 1980s began the saga between Merck Sharp and Dome, seen there in the Suir Valley, south of Clonmel, and a neighbouring farmer, John Hanrahan, who complained that emissions from the plant were affecting his livestock and also his own health and that of his family. Soon, pictures such as like that, deformed calves, dead cattle being buried on the farm, began to dominate newspaper stories. The government took it very seriously. By 1984, 5 government departments, 3 university chemistry departments, 3 research institutes, and innumerable consultancies were involved trying to identify the cause. Inevitably, it would end up in court. But in 1985, the High Court judgment was, the plaintiffs have accordingly wholly failed to discharge the onus of proof upon them of establishing that the injury to health, animal and plant life of which they complain was caused by the emissions from the defendant's factory. It follows that the plaintiff's claim must be dismissed. A devastating blow to the Hanrahans. But there was an appeal to the Supreme Court. And in the 5th of July, 1988, 3 years later, the Supreme Court announced, Justice Seamus Henchy, I would therefore allow the appeal against the finding that the plaintiffs had not established as a matter of probability that the complaints about the condition of their cattle were not causally linked to toxic emissions from the defendant's factory. In a sense, what Justice Seamus Henchy to the layman said, there's nothing else in the in the valley that could possibly cause these problems. According to the factory's own records, there were times when the plant incinerator was not operated at the proper temperature. So therefore, that is the only possible cause, and it allowed the judgment for the Hanrans, which must come as a huge relief to them. But it caused consternation in the industry. And at the same time, the same year, summer '88, another controversy was coming to a peak. Merrill Dow had announced that they were setting up a plant, a major synthesis plant in Cork, but not in Ringaskiddy or Little Island. They were going out to Virgin Territory near Youghal in a lovely little valley, the Womana Valley, and they were going to build a plant there. And the reaction of local people was instant and well organized. You can see there, people arriving for a meeting. Thou shalt not kill. Chemical factories kill. Now bear in mind, at this stage, Dow were manufacturing Agent Orange for use in Vietnam as a defoliant. So their name was not good at that stage. East Cork says no to Merrill Dow. Merrill Dow achieved planning permission, which was appealed. They got the planning permission. But with the build-up of local opposition to them, they decided to pull out, and they announced that they would not be proceeding. Now, the reaction to both of those cases, the Hanran versus Merck Sharp and Dow, Merck Sharp and Dome, and the local people around Youghal to Merrill Dow, in a way, put a huge question mark, not over the existing plants, but to any future development of the industry. And looking at the reports in the Irish Times, the editorial in the Irish Times, and in other papers, all were questioning the pharmaceutical industry, the chemical industry. And an opinion poll at the time showed a majority of people against further investment by the IDA in chemical and pharmaceutical plants. But there was another game changer, and that was Sandus, or Novartis as we know it now, which announced in 1989 it was going to build a large plant in Ringaskiddy. At the press conference, Winifred Peterson, the Sandus project manager, said, we feel that nowhere in the world can we get as good a package as Ireland. It is important to Sandus that it be welcome to the region. If Ireland says no, we'll have to go elsewhere. And right from the beginning, he made it very clear that the people who mattered were the people of Ringaskiddy, not NGOs in Dublin or anywhere else like that, but the people of Ringaskiddy. Now, the tone for the discussion was set at that press conference when the first question was, how can you assure the people of Cork Harbour that you are not going to do to the harbour what you did to the Rhine in 1986, when a discharge of firewater, contaminated firewater, had killed life in the Rhine for about 30 miles downstream? The Sandus people, aided by the IDA, John Conlon in particular, intense local engagement, everybody focusing on the local people, engaging with the local community council, making changes that they requested, bringing in the idea, subscribing to the idea of herd monitoring. At the end of it, there was a local plebiscite. 60% voted in favour. Not an overwhelming majority, but once they got that approval, they went ahead building that particular plant in Ringaskiddy. Now, but some of us would remember the former Hixon plant and the fire there, which created that image of a black cloud over Cork Harbour, which again shows that you cannot be too careful. Thanks to the EPA and to the companies themselves, huge investment has eliminated all of pollution problems from the plants. However, also at this stage, there was a mega change in the focus within the industry. And the industry and the IDA began to concentrate on biopharmaceuticals. The first big biopharmaceutical plant was the Wyatt plant in Grange Castle, seen there, now owned by Pfizer. Also on formulation plants. The first big one, a number of the smaller companies, such as Leo Laboratories, had always been formulating, packing, and finishing the products. Wyatt had bought the former Polaroid factory in Newbridge and had put in a major finishing plant there, which Pfizer expanded and developed on. Indeed, it is said, some people have done the maths and have said that the development of the Pfizer finishing plant in Newbridge led to the closure of 18 other plants across Europe as operations were centralized in Newbridge. So in the 30 years since 1990, biopharmaceuticals, formulation, finishing, packing plants, and these had greater added value, more labor and local linkages, in particular the packaging industry. An example of that, when Allergan came, and I'll come back to Allergan later, when Allergan came to Ireland in 1977, the local printing works, Joe Berry's, employed about 3 people doing the printing requirements for small town Ireland, raffle tickets, GA programs, etc. They started working with Allergan, and it took them 15 years of working together to get the products up to the standards required. The mechanical standards, a high-speed packing line doing 400 or 500 packs a minute. You have to have the cartons, the inserts, the labels absolutely right. And when you're exporting pharmaceuticals across the world, the text has to be absolutely right. In the pharmaceutical industry, you want to avoid recalls. A recall is not only that you got something wrong, but you're publicly advertising that you got it wrong by having to recall. 90% of recalls in the industry come from printing errors. So when Joe Berry sold his printing business to a multinational packaging supply company in the early 2000s, it was employing 130 people. And the entry into Allergan not only gave them that market, but because they were supplying Allergan, they got into supplying Leo Laboratories, Glaxo, Pfizer, etc. Also, you had the development of global service centers and homegrown engineering support. I don't need to tell you the success of the DPSs, the PMs. But I remember Michael Mulhall of DPS when there was less than a half dozen people in DPS. And now it's over 1,000. PM, double that. These are worldwide, highly respected companies in the engineering consultancies. You also had the industry academia linkages, NIBRD, other ones linking up with UCC, with the University of Limerick, the Bernal Institute, and so on like that. All of these have created what I called in the book a pharmaceutical ecosystem, all giving tremendous support. And the existence of that support is a huge draw for other companies to come to Ireland. You take Pfizer. The bottom half of that picture there is BioMarin. Pfizer had developed that, but then when they bought the Grange Castle, they didn't need it. Some other company came in. You had a ready-made factory. The same thing happened with Amgen coming into Dunleary, with Hovione coming into Ringaskiddy. Factories that had become surplus to requirement were sold on to others. Johnson & Johnson then built their biopharma plant there. So you can see the ongoing investment. In 1962, 803 people employed. 2020, 35,352. That's direct employment. In Irish-owned companies, which is a lecture in itself how these have developed, some 3,348. Estimated indirect in these companies that I mentioned in the ecosystem, another 35,000. Total economic contribution, estimated 14.73 billion. Local purchases, packaging, etc., 968 million. And exports, and I only think about manufactured exports, not services, almost 80 billion. And that just shows the growth of it and also the proportion, how it came from virtually non-existent to 80% of the manufactured exports. And we look at Allergan. Now bear in mind Allergan, the population of Allergan itself, of Westport itself, is just under 5,000. Direct investment, 610 million. Direct employment in Westport, 1,238 people. And that was in 2017. Since then, it has expanded further. It's now nearly 1,500 in Westport. It supports the whole of West Mayo, a lot of people say. They also built a plant in Dublin and a services centre where logistics, purchasing, etc., distribution is controlled worldwide from an office in Earlsford Terrace. Direct local expenditure, 323 million. Indirect local expenditure, 91 million. And as I mentioned earlier, the impact on packaging suppliers. But what about the future? That's grand. That's the history. What about the future? Well, Niels Bohr said, prediction is very difficult, especially if it is about the future. But look at where we're starting from and compare this to where the country, where the sector started from in 1960, in 1962. The small number of underutilized plants lacking modern equipment. We have the most modern network of capital-intensive plants in the world. We have a proven record of staff, and that is critical. And that is a feature that impresses people, is the quality of the people. Virtually all of the plants in Ireland are managed by Irish people. And Irish people are strongly represented at higher levels within the organization, both in small plants and in larger plants. You have that supportive infrastructure, NIBRD. When Takeda were thinking of building a biopharmaceutical plant in Dublin, they approached NIBRD and asked NIBRD what training courses could they offer. And NIBRD said, what training courses do you want? We will tailor the courses to suit what exactly you want. We will do the training either in Tala Institute of Technology, as it was at the time, or we'll do it on site, or a combination of both. We will do it at the time and in the numbers that you require. And that response impressed Takeda hugely. And that's the kind of response they got from every agency. We will do whatever you want to support you. Now, there is excess capacity globally. There's no doubt about it. And companies have been outsourcing on manufacture, creating more excess capacity. And that has hit Ireland. When Pfizer went through their big spree in the noughties, where they bought Warner Lambert, they bought Pharmacia, they bought Wyeth, etc., etc. They ended up with 97 manufacturing plants around the world. They reckoned they needed about 53. In Ireland, I think they were 9 or 10, and they decided they needed 4. So they had plants for sale. But with the cooperation of the plants, the companies themselves, and of the IDA, the vast majority of those were sold on. Amgen got the plant in Dunleary, Hovione got a plant in Ringaskiddy, etc., etc. The only time it didn't work was, unfortunately, Syntex at Clarecastle. That is now being demolished. Companies outsource manufacture, but that gave an opportunity for contract manufacturing, the CMOs, the Hoviones, the Sigma Aldriches, other big players to come into Ireland. So we created, if you like, a subset of contract manufacturers who came in, bought ready-made plants, and very often when companies were closing down a plant, they would sell the plant and also give a contract to the manufacturer, to the new owner of the plant. And finally, they changed the corporation profits tax for the first time. I think the government fought a good fight on that. And I think 15% it still gives a competitive advantage, a lower competitive advantage, but it still gives a competitive advantage. But above all, it's the excellence of the people. And when Christoph Weber was opening, the CEO of Takeda, was opening the plant out in Grange Castle, he talked about the close and excellent collaboration with universities that delivers the people Takeda and other companies in the pharma sector need, specifically for the new innovative technologies coming on stream. The plant has a really good record on quality, safety, process development skills. They, that is the staff, continuously improve the processes. They attract the new people. And that is what we looked for when we decided on the investment. His emphasis was on the people and on the performance of the people. And that, combined with the incredible amount of investment that is already there. Like on average, the pharma industry in ongoing capital investment in the existing plants invests about €1 billion a year. I think last year was in the order of 1.5 billion. And companies do not walk away from that level of investment at a moment's notice. So I am very confident in the future of the industry, of the sector. I think it is an Irish success story, an incredible and remarkable Irish success story, and one that deserves to be told. Now, not only that, but also they've added to the landscape. Not all pharmaceutical plants look the same. Pinewood Laboratories in Ballymacarbery, Sandus in Killorglin, Servier in Arklow. I remember talking to the MD of Servier and asked him what was the basis for the design. And he said, we wanted to replicate, if we could, the design of a prominent building in Wicklow. So they modeled it on Rusborough House. And you can see the extensions to the back. They do not look like pharmaceutical buildings, but I think it adds greatly to the landscape there. The laboratory is still there in Crumlin after what 65 years. It reached it cannot expand any further. Every piece of ground is taken up, but it's still there, employing some 450 people. And also you see for a lot of the plants, renewable energy coming into play. So wanting to tell that success story, that great Irish success story, led me to write the book. So if there are any questions now, I'll take those. And thank you for your attention.
Hello, folks. As we said earlier, if you put the questions in the Q&A, and we have 2 questions up already. I'll start with the first one there from Kieran McGreal. With the talk of the corporate tax level rising in the near future here in Ireland, do Pat and the other panelists feel Ireland's reputation as a destination for multinationals will outweigh a rise in the corporate tax level, and will we remain an attractive location due to our labour force, our geographic position, etc.? So over to you, Pat, maybe.
Well, you know, to some extent, I addressed that. I think 15% is still competitive. And the important thing is being competitive. If it went higher than that, I would be worried. If it reached 20%, I would be very, very seriously worried. But at 15%, it's bearable, given the other advantages. Like, I actually think, I'm sure of one thing, that Ireland does not, the pharmaceutical industry does not exist here solely because of the corporation profits tax. It's a 3-legged stool, really. You have the tax issue, you've got the people issue, and you have the supporting environment. You have all of those. But if one got seriously out of kilter, and the most likely one is the tax issue, it could. But I think 15% is bearable. If it went significantly beyond that, I think it could provide a problem. But you come back to the fact that one of the last of the big multinationals that did not have a manufacturing presence here, AstraZeneca, announced that they were building. Pfizer are investing a huge amount in expanding both the original plant in Ringaskiddy, the plant in Newbridge, and Grange Castle. Merck are doing the same with all of their plants. There's sufficient ongoing investment on it. And the other area that, as I mentioned earlier on, that the development of the Irish pharmaceutical industry, the homegrown industry, it's worthy of a study in itself. I mentioned it briefly, but you have in the biopharmaceutical sector, you have what I call the Elan alumni, guys who came when Elan shut down, who had tremendous expertise and who set up their own companies, managed to secure venture capital on the Irish market. And you have quite a number of those companies set up. Not all will be successful, but a lot of them are becoming successful, having identified tiny niche products. And now there is another issue facing the industry, and that is cost. The cost of these biopharmaceuticals is incredible. There is one for the treatment of a very rare condition, neurological condition. The cost per person for treating it is in excess of €1 million. There's another one for the treatment of an inherited sight deficiency, inherited blindness. The cost for treating that is £623,000. And it's just one injection, but the costs are enormous. The benefits are equally enormous. But it does put a question to the health systems. Do you want to spend €1 million or £1 million on one patient, how many patients could you treat with other diseases? So that's an issue for the industry, which I believe it's addressing creatively, but that's a separate discussion. So sorry to come back to you, it's rather a long-winded one. I think the question of tax, we can live with 15%. We will still continue to be very, very attractive, particularly the quality of the people and the reputation that the existing plants have gained within the corporations of delivery, of quality delivery. And that is what will stand to us, the people. Sorry.
Grant, I have another question here from Kevin Murphy. Do you think the education system still supports the training and development of the people to support the industry?
I think more and more what you're looking at is that the primary degree has become, in a way, the equivalent of the old Leaving Cert. People do it almost automatically. What matters is, what do they do next? Do they go into specialized training? Do they go into, we say, courses to settle them to that? We have a very high percentage of people doing third level, but it's getting those focused. And that is why places like NIBRD are so important, because they provide focused training specifically aimed at the industry, what the company in question wants. And there's also another aspect helping us. I remember back in 2004, when you had all the new accessions to the EU. And unexpectedly, Ireland decided not to have any restriction on immigration. And it did so because it wanted to preserve the common travel area with the UK, who had already decided no restrictions. So almost by default and unexpectedly, we got an influx from Eastern Europe of and my own experience in Leo Laboratories, or Leo Pharma, as it's called now, my own experience there was of the very high quality of people coming in with a tremendous work ethic. And that has continued. So immigration into Ireland, it's not just the guys on the building sites or picking fruit for Keelings in North Dublin or whatever. It's also highly qualified third level graduates in the sciences. And I think they're found now in most companies. So I'm confident that we can meet that question, or we can meet that challenge of continuing to provide good, high quality people. Right.
I have another one there for you, Tiernan. Is there a trend whereby those engineering support companies like DPS, which you mentioned, are turning towards outsourcing their services to countries with lower employment costs?
I don't know that. What I do know is, because of the reputation they acquire with companies here in Ireland, they've been able to expand. So, for example, PM DPS have offices in Brussels, in the US, in Singapore. At least one of them has an office in Hong Kong. They expand outside with that. I don't know if they're outsourcing the, if you like, the low skill element of their work. I've no evidence of it, but then again, it's not an area that I actually looked at.
I have a couple more, so I'll just go through them. Shane O'Donnell, does Pat think the presence of big pharma has had a positive or negative effect on the success of Irish startups in the field?
A hugely positive effect. You have a spillover. You have a spillover of people who, we say, got training, who started their professional careers in big pharma and then moved to small pharma, because they carry with them knowledge. The best way and the cheapest way to transfer knowledge, to transfer information, is with the individual. And that has happened. And there have been studies done, and I've quoted some of them in the book, which shows you the positive spillover from big pharma into small farm. And in a way, Elan for a period could have been called big pharma. But the spillover when that closed into smaller companies, into set-up companies across the country has been hugely positive. Guys like Seamus Mulligan coming out of Elan and using their knowledge and using their contacts to start up companies and to invest and to develop small companies here in Ireland. So I think it's been hugely positive.
Just to say my own experience there, I worked with Angus Isochem, which is now Hovione, and I went from there to Aaron Chemicals up in Athlone, which was a startup. And, you know I was the only person at the plant who had actually made chemicals. My boss had run distilleries, so that's where the information came. We've a couple more. John Byrne, with new apprenticeships being introduced, is there something that could be introduced to support the pharma industry? What are the biggest needs?
Well, there have been steps. The Industry Federation, Biopharmaceuticals Ireland, have done this idea of developing an apprenticeship with TIT so that operators can, with training, become laboratory technicians without having to go through the full course, using the, if you like, their existing knowledge of the pharma industry. So there have been, and I think there will be more of them, if you like, focused apprenticeships, focused partnerships between the industry and local IT. Now, I know they're all becoming technical universities, but hopefully they will continue to provide a local service and to build connections locally.
Another one from Martin McCarthy. Any sense of, first, Pat, well done, and then any sense of the impact of Brexit?
No sense of that at all. See, in a way, if you think about it, Ireland in the global supply chain, most of the products will go to Antwerp, making Belgium a huge exporter of products for onward distribution. And in a way, the problem of crossing the borders and so on like that doesn't really arise for most of the finished products. The one area, the one impact of Brexit on one company that I saw was Alan McLean's company, Almac, in Northern Ireland, big employer in Northern Ireland, set up an office and a plant in Dundalk so that they could cover themselves, so they would have a presence within the Union as well as within the UK. So that's the only one that I could say that I know of where there's been a direct Brexit impact.
I've just one last question is from myself. Pat, do you see one or two companies have started continuous processing of pharmaceuticals?
Yeah.
Do you see that expanding at all, or how do you see that going?
I think it has to expand. Now, in the book, I talk about that, and I quote a number of FDA people who say that the pharmaceutical industry is remarkably inefficient in many ways. And part of the inefficiency lies in the batch nature of most of the productions, the cleaning, etc. So that there will be, driven by cost, there will be a move towards continuous processing with continuous monitoring and analysis and so on like that. I think it will come. It'll be slow because the industry will be slow to change. It's always been slow to change, but it will come. And I think continuous processing, well, I think it's the future for it.